There are various versions of a moral argument for the existence of God. I'll look at this one from C.S. Lewis. This is from just a few pages out of his book, Mere Christianity. And it's really not intended as a strong philosophical argument, but it gives you some idea of how somebody might reason to the existence of God from moral concerns. So here's how the argument goes. If there is something, and we'll put that capital S there intentionally, something like God behind the universe, it would reveal itself within us. We'll talk about why that's the case in a moment. We do, in fact, have a moral law that reveals itself within us. And so, therefore, we have evidence that there is something like God behind the universe. Now, as it's presented here, it's not that overwhelming of an argument. You could strengthen this in various ways. We'll look at another version at the end of this video. But this at least gives us some indication that God exists when we consider moral principles. Now, before C.S. Lewis begins his investigation of the moral concerns related to God, he does briefly address something like a teleological argument or various teleological arguments. He was not addressing the contemporary design argument, which was not available to him when he was writing this in the 1940s. So he does sum up responses to the classic or modern teleological argument as either the idea that one can be rational and conclude that the universe and ourselves are here by chance, given what we know about the universe. This would be the materialist view that has been around for centuries and centuries. Or one might conclude that there is a rational designer behind the universe, as did Aquinas, for example. And this would be the religious view, the idea that our observations of the universe indicates that there is an intelligent designer or God. So Lewis says, you could be rational and take either path given what we know about the universe. So how should we evaluate options at this point? The alternatives, the materialist view or the religious view, really can't be evaluated by science. And the question of whether there is a designer behind the nature or behind the universe is not really a scientific question. So that's why it can't be evaluated by science. If there is something behind nature, Lewis argues, it will have to reveal itself in some way other than by physical means. It has to use some other mechanism to communicate to us the idea that it exists. So Lewis asked, is there something that reveals itself in the only way it can, within us, internally, somehow, within ourselves? And his answer is going to be yes, of course. But before we get to that answer, let's take a moment to consider descriptive and normative statements. There is another video that I've done that takes this a little more carefully. But you can describe something in this way. So for example, the cat has two tails. So here's a cat, has two tails. And to be honest, I'm not even sure if this photo is doctored. My son has a cat with 8 toes, or 9 or 10 toes, depending on your count, on each of its front paws. In any case, that's a similar situation. Now, that's a description. The cat has 2 tails, or the cat has 8 to 10 toes on each front paw. A normative statement would be the cat should not have an extra tail, or the cat should only have 5 toes on its front paws. When you say things like should or ought, you are appealing to a normative standard in what you're saying. And that's what's going on with moral claims. So Lewis says there is a moral law, and he calls this the law of human nature. a law within us that tells us about right and wrong, how we ought to behave, what we should do. And this law makes us feel guilty when we don't obey it, or affirms us when we do. And the law is not mere description, it is normative. It says things about what we ought to do, how we ought to behave, what should be done, what's morally right or wrong. And this law is not observable by science, right? If alien beings came down and observed humans interacting with one another without understanding our language or any documents that we've written, the aliens would observe that sometimes we are helpful for one another and sometimes we are harmful to one another. And you wouldn't necessarily observe anything about a moral code because clearly there are murders, rapes, thefts, and so on occurring amongst humans. So this isn't the kind of thing that's observable by science. And Lewis mentions very briefly that rejecting the law, saying there is no such thing, has serious consequences. And he might identify personal ones, like if you deny that there's such a thing as a moral law within you, that might turn you into a rather rotten person. Now, not necessarily someone that's a thief or a murderer or is a lawbreaker or anything necessarily like that, but it would mean that you would become prideful and arrogant and selfish and greedy and those kinds of things that make a person rather unpleasant to be around. Now, another serious consequence of denying the idea that there is an objective moral law, and here I explore this much more extensively in my videos on objective morality and subjective morality, but the consequence would be there is no right or wrong. There are only mere preferences or maybe statistical regularities. And that bottom line of that view would be, it would imply things like rape and murder are not morally wrong. They just happen to go against standards that we describe. Another consequence would be we'd have to give up any basis, any grounding, any foundation for morally criticizing any other person or a culture, like the 9/11 bombers or Stalin or Nazis or mass shooters from the one from Vegas. And of course, we could list numerous others. We don't need to. But without a moral law, what they're doing is not really morally wrong, so there's no basis to criticize what they're doing. An aspect of the moral law, again, is that it's not observable. So once again, no one would know about this law by mere observation of human behavior. As you look at other people, as you watch other people behave, it's not clear that there is a moral law. That certainly there might be principles of etiquette, standards that might vary from culture to culture. But a moral law, that doesn't seem observable at all. Yet we are familiar with ourselves, more familiar with ourselves than anything else. You are more familiar with you than anything else in the world. And so moral principles known from within, things that you know are morally right or wrong, that's our best evidence that there's an intelligence behind the universe. It is communicating to us in the only way that it could within us, giving us moral guidelines, normative standards of behavior. Now, again, to clarify, right, these are moral principles. These are not pragmatic rules of behavior. These are genuine moral laws that Lewis is talking about. And what could be the source of moral laws? Lewis argues, it seems to me at least, his argument is an argument to the best explanation. The best explanation of there being moral laws is the existence of God. So that's Lewis's argument. Let's consider one other version. William Lane Craig has a moral argument, and he is ubiquitous on the web, so you could find him defending this moral argument, I'm confident, elsewhere. But in very succinct terms, Craig sets it up as a modus tollens here. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do in fact exist. Therefore, we can conclude that God exists. Now, this is very much in the spirit of C.S. Lewis in his moral argument, and you could see why Craig sets it up this way. Now we have a valid deductive argument form instead of our argument to the best explanation. Which form is better? I'll leave it for you to judge, but those are just a couple examples of moral arguments for the existence of God.